who would win in a fight between Stolas and Alastor? When it comes to talking about two very powerful characters from each respective Vivzie product, the Helluva boss Stolas versus Alastor from Hazbin Hotel is a pretty good one. And on top of that, when it comes to talking about fights that have been popular throughout the whole runs of Hazbin Hotel and Helluva boss, this is a pretty common one due to things like author statements, hierarchy, misuse, and etc. Now for this specific video, we're going to go over 4 different parts of the conversation: the feats and statements of each character, then we'll go over the hierarchy and why it should or shouldn't be used. The next one will be the Vivzie statement herself and what her opinion is, and whether or not we should use that. And the last one will be who actually wins the conversation. Or should I say, who actually wins the fight. Now without further ado, let's actually get into Alastor versus Stolas. Now first things first, when it comes to talking about Alastor versus Stolas, his feats and statements are pretty simple. Of course, starting off, we know he's one of the few characters in canon with confirmed feats of actually defeating a bunch of overlords. Because if we look back at Alastor's backstory, whether it be through Mimsie's version or Vaggie's version, it's seemingly pretty obvious that Alastor defeats overlords pretty easily. And that's not even everything when you consider the fact that Alastor seems to be the strongest of the overlords. If we take a quick jump back to the original Alastor backstory from Vaggie, Vaggie explains that there's been no mortal soul to harness the type of power that Alastor has in regards to being able to defeat multiple overlords. This is extremely impressive when you remember the fact that every overlord that we see in canon has a mortal soul. Because to explain it pretty simply, every overlord that we see in canon is just a sinner who rose through the ranks. This also makes a ton of sense when you consider that Alastor is one of the only overlords we've seen in canon that we know a lot about that doesn't have some type of economical influence that influences their ranking. Because you gotta remember what Carmilla says. When Carmilla's talking about the power of the overlord, she references the millions of soul under their control, which is pretty good evidence for the idea that overlord ranking isn't just about strength, but it's also their economic influence. This is why Rosie has control over Cannibal Town, Vox has control of the technological output across Hell, Velvet's economical influence comes from things like fashion, also things like beautician product, Valentino's influence comes from things like the adult film industry, and Carmilla Carmine's influence comes from the gun trade. Now what does Alastor have? If you think about it, Alastor doesn't really have any control over the economy. You could say things like radio, but that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It's not like he was playing ads through the radio or something like that. It was mostly screams of overlord's death. And if we're using stuff like that, we're seemingly in agreement that Alastor's ranking seems to come purely from strength and nothing else. Now that we talked about that, let's quickly cut back to the Vaggie backstory. Now something else that's mentioned in the Vaggie backstory is the idea that Alastor's power seems to rival some of the most ancient and evil things in Hell, and what's being shown is both overlords and Ask Goetia. Now personally, the way I interpret this statement is the idea that overlords and Ask Goetia, at least the ones with books, seem to rival one another. The reason this makes sense is that they're referred to in pretty relative stance in terms of power, and the reason this has to be referring to book-based Ask Goetia is the idea that if an Ask Goetia doesn't have a book, they're pretty weak. That's why Octavia is at such a big risk being in the human world with no sense of her power. And the same goes for Stolas. Without his book, he's not nearly as powerful as he is with his book. Now in fairness, a more charitable interpretation for the Ask Goetia is the idea that they just rival Alastor and not necessarily all the other characters that are overlords. Now to be fair, I can already guess your arguments. You're going to say something along the lines of, well, the hierarchy says this and it disagrees with you. Wait a minute, I do talk about the hierarchy a little later in this video and I do explain why it doesn't disagree with me. Now before I move on to Stolas, let's go through what people will bring up as anti-feats for Alastor and explain why they're not truly anti-feats. Now first things first, a lot of people might try and bring up the argument that Vox supposedly beat Alastor. Now first things first, what Valentino actually says to Vox is, are you still mad that Alastor almost beat you? For one, why would you be mad if you won the fight? And on top of that, only minutes after this is stated, Alastor actually says that Vox is powerless if it wasn't for the help of the other Vs, which kind of implies that Vox might have actually had help when fighting Alastor the first time. And even with that said help that probably happened, Vox still almost lost the fight. Now the next big anti-feat that everyone likes to bring up is the idea that Alastor lost to Adam. Now for one, that doesn't really mean much since Adam has no comparative scaling to the Ask Goetia, which is what we're talking about. And two, within the greater context of the series, this seems to be more of a good feat for Adam than a bad feat for Alastor. Now that's pretty much the two major anti-feats that everyone brings up. Now let's talk about Stolas' scaling and explain why Stolas is so powerful. First things first, for Stolas, the biggest thing going for him is the idea that you need some special weaponry to defeat him. This is why Striker has a blessing tip rifle to try and take him down. Now you could definitely argue that the only reason Striker used this type of weapon was because he wasn't strong enough to do it himself, since he's just a basic imp with no real supernatural strength. But I would definitely still say it's worth noting, and on top of that, Stolas does have one of the strongest AP feats we've seen in the series. When Stolas is doing the Moon Crescent Festival along with the imps, he manages to split the sky, splitting all the clouds, which was a large mountain level feat, which is far and away the strongest calculable feat we've seen in canon. And on top of this, in terms of durability, he's also increasingly strong when you consider the fact that Blitz finds it almost impossible for someone to be able to harm Stolas, which is kind of crazy when you think about it. He's fought plenty of people, yet he finds the very idea of just being able to damage Stolas near impossible. Also on top of this, Stolas doesn't seem to be a weak book-based Goetia. If you think about it, he doesn't seem to fear Stella's brother whatsoever, which is kind of telling since Stella's always threatened him with it. Now to be fair, this is pretty much everything I have to go over with Stolas apart from the hierarchy and the Vivzie statement, so let's get into those real quick before we go to conclusion. Now first things first, if you didn't know, this interview right here back from September 2020 is actually where the hierarchy comes from. Now, there's a few things we have to understand about this interview to understand the hierarchy. For one, power and strength are never mentioned when explaining the hierarchy. And to further clarify, Vivzie seems to explain the hierarchy as a socio-economic one. This is why when Vivzie's explaining the hierarchy, she describes hellhounds and imps as the bottom because they're supposed to represent lower class and lower middle class. She explains they're the ones that get the menial jobs, lower class workers, things like factory workers, retail workers, etc. And this is also why when she explains it, she gives Charlie a higher rank than the 7 deadly sins because she's the heir to the throne. She's the next in line. And even just think about it for a second. Hellhounds are at the bottom, yet they're used as security within the verse. Why would security be the weakest? It makes no sense. It's counterintuitive. And even think about Hellborns like the shark race. None of the sharks are nearly as powerful as the imps we've seen. There's no shark in canon that's comparable to even the 4th strongest imp. Yet for obvious reasons, they seem to rank higher than imps because they're Hellborn over imps. Imps are the low class. Also, take a character like Striker for example. Striker's whole character revolves around the idea that the class of imp doesn't define his strength. Now, just to quickly clarify, I'm not saying the hierarchy has nothing to do with strength. I'm just saying strength isn't a deciding factor, which is also why Alastor's compared to Goetia, yet he's a rank below them. Now, finally, let's go over the final piece of evidence for this video, which is the Vivzie interview. Vivzie does say Stolas wins. But to quickly defend Alastor for a second, it should be mentioned that Vivzie also says she's unsure of who will win the fight and she hasn't really thought about it. On top of that, the majority of the other people that spoke up on the livestream who work on the show also disagreed with Vivzie and said that Alastor would win. Which means to me, I don't find it to be the big slam dunk that most people seem to think it is. Which also brings us to the conclusion of this video. I do think Alastor wins this fight, but let me explain a little bit more why. So first things first, there seems to be evidence that implies the Goetia are comparable to overlords, judging by Vaggy's version of the backstory. Now let's take that into account. Alastor's one of, if not the strongest overlords, while Stolas has no confirmed ranking within the books. And while taking that into account, we also know Alastor has access to angelic metal as he used it against some of the angels. Also on top of this, from everything we know, Alastor's probably the better fighter and has more battle experience than even Stolas does. And with all that taken into account and reminding you the Vivzie statement context and on top of that the hierarchy context, I don't really see a good way the Goetia Stolas can win. Especially when you take into account that Alastor's magic seems to be far better formed for fighting than Stolas's does. Which brings me to the conclusion that Alastor would probably wreck Stolas in a one-on-one fight, and I don't really see a good way Stolas could win.